Hey everyone! With the MediEvil Remake now on the horizon, coming out today even, people are already jumping into the next question, which is, if they can remake the original, can they also remake the sequel? Does the sequel even deserve a remake? Back when I first played MediEvil 2, I remembered enjoying some aspects of it, but overall not liking it as much as the original. Thinking about that left me even more curious as to how I'd feel about it now. So, let's not waste any more time and find out how MediEvil 2 for the PlayStation 1 holds up today. After the successful launch of the first MediEvil, Sony greenlit a sequel with James Shepard replacing Chris Sorrell as the game's director. Shepard believed that the first game's ending left them open to place Sir Daniel Fortescue into a different time period, settling on the idea of Victorian-era London as the game's new setting. After settling on this new direction and reworking the original game's engine from the ground up, our newest adventure came to be. Players will notice that things are the same, but different. But the same, but different. The most obvious change, and one of the biggest factors people are likely to talk about, is that the game is no longer, well, medieval. Taking place 500 years later, the game now has a completely different change of atmosphere. It's not bad per se, just different. Being in Victorian-era London, your gothic elements now include dinosaur bones, vampires, steampunk, circuses, pumpkins, again, nice, nods to H.G. Wells, and even Jack the Ripper. And he's reptilian! Yes, after many years have passed, Dan has been relegated to a mere museum showpiece. Ugh. Once Lord Palethorn, a sorcerer and follower of Zarek's work, comes into contact with Zarek's old spellbook, he attempts to perform the spell that raised the dead in the first game. It works, and pages become scattered about as the dead come back once again. And just like the last time, it brings back one other former hero.
Sir Daniel Fortescue, back from the dead once again.
Dan is understandably confused at his new settings, but he has the ghost Winston Chapelmount, an obvious Churchill reference, to give all of the important gameplay information. And the obvious information.
Man, without a ringmaster, the imps are going crazy. They're up to something, but I don't know what.
Dan also comes into contact with mad scientist Hamilton Kift, who works alongside Dan to recover the pages and help stop the undead forces. Dan also encounters Kia, a former Egyptian princess who aids Professor Kift in his work and serves as a love interest for Dan. You can also buy items and enhancements from the Spiv, who reminds me of the merchant from Resident Evil 4. First, let's talk about what stayed the same. Dan still controls relatively the same way he did in the original MediEvil, and a large number of his weapons from the original also found their way back, including his swords, shields, hammer, crossbow, and even the infamous chicken drumsticks. Level structure is also the same, with Dan exploring, solving puzzles, and defeating enemies in order to fill a chalice that can then be used to unlock a new weapon. You still have your share of fountains of rejuvenation, and energy vials to get your health back with. Just as with the first game, you also deal with multiple bosses and other puzzles and obstacles to overcome. The changes made to the game, however, are much more vast. The graphics appear much cleaner and more polished, with character models looking smoother in motion, and showing more recognizable facial expressions. Although the game has new characters with new voices, Dan's voice was completely changed this time around, from the low-pitched, angry grunting sounds to a much higher-pitched voice that occasionally speaks complete sentences.
Let's investigate. No, not me. I'll quit.
It was a little jarring at first, but I eventually adjusted. Although there are less stages in this game than in the first MediEvil, this is made up for by the sheer size of them. Levels are now far larger and more open to exploration than ever before, which will be a plus to some and a negative to others. More on that later. They are also typically split into two parts, allowing Dan to save about halfway in. Instead of a world map, you now visit Professor Kift's lab between each stage, where you can pick up the chalice if you collected enough souls for it, talk with the professor to discuss story developments, and select levels through his projector. There are also far more cutscenes this time around, which help present the story in a more cinematic format than in the first game, where you would pick up the pieces through various writings. Being in a new time period, we also get to witness new weapons for Sir Dan, including a pistol, cane stick, bombs, and my personal favorite, the Gatling gun. Dan also gains a new super armor near the end of the game, which provides even more protection from hits on top of using your shield. The developers also added a host of new gameplay touches that were not initially possible in the first MediEvil. One of the most surprising is being able to take Dan's head off his body and place it on any of the moving green hands that used to follow you in the original. This allows you to reach smaller, otherwise unreachable places and becomes a central part of puzzle solving as the game goes on. It was a welcome addition to the gameplay formula, and I kind of regret that we never had it in the first game. Another nice change of pace was the ability to switch between two weapons, making the time spent selecting them on your menu to be much less tedious and bothersome. There were other minigames added to keep things from getting stale or boring. One of the most unique ideas is definitely here, a stage where you have to help the professor build a giant Frankenstein-like body, which Dan eventually places his head onto after a mishap with the other one. Here, you have to enter a boxing match with a warrior from Palethorn's team. During the fight, you're likely to lose limbs, and actually have the chance to get them back from imps in between each round. I had never seen anything quite like it before, and admittedly got a real kick out of it. If you couldn't tell by now, the game toned down the creepiness factor and focused on making things more silly and humorous instead. This is likely going to be a sore spot for some people, as part of the original's charm is in just how spooky the whole thing is, with little bits of humor scattered about. Now it seems that the scales were tipped heavily in the opposite direction. But is the game itself good? Better than the original even? There's a lot to dissect here. Let's start with the good. As I said before, the graphical updates are great, and really do bring out a whole other level of personality that we never got to see in the original game. I think you will agree that the differences are night and day here. I also loved a lot of the new gameplay ideas presented. Being able to place Dan's head on a hand for more level exploration was just the kind of wacky change I was hoping to see. I also loved the creativity behind specific levels, like the one where Dan gets his head stolen by a pigeon and has to use the Dan hand camera view to see where it got taken off to. Utilizing this setup of switching in order to solve puzzles was another great idea, and I give serious credit to the developers for coming up with it. While the comedy was a little much, I did find myself chuckling at least a few times, usually due to the sheer absurdity of the situations Dan would get himself into. The boxing match I described above was certainly one of them. And then there's the matter of Dan having to get a membership card in disguise in order to enter a club. I mean, he's wearing a beard and a top hat. What is not to love there, people? By far my favorite boss fight was with the Count. At the beginning of the fight, you have to angle the mirrors around you so that his shots will reflect off it and back to him while you're dodging the attack. After he gets hit a few times, windows begin to reveal themselves and the strategy changes to flipping all 4 mirrors so that they'll reflect and hit the Count with a blast of light. Creative fights like this one always stand out to me, and I was happy to see it in action. Unfortunately, it's not all sunshine and rainbows, however. Most of the issues that plagued the original release are still here, with the camera being front and center. In fact, at times, I actually found it to be worse than it was in the first MediEvil. In the original game, there wasn't a huge amount of platforming in it, which was actually fine since it was considered to be one of the gameplay's weaker aspects. Here, they appear to have doubled down on it in a strange twist of design, particularly in the final 2 stages, where you run into all kinds of awkward jumps. This wouldn't be so terrible except for 2 big factors. The insufferable camera, which seems hell-bent on throwing off my aim, and the new drop damage. Yes, Dan can now take damage whenever he falls too far off a ledge or platform. This can range from taking a small portion of your health to an entire life bottle if you fall too far in. On that topic, health is another issue. In the previous title, you could simply go back to an old stage, find your fountains of rejuvenation, and get your health back that way. Now, if you take all of the energy in one of said fountains, it's gone forever, and the only other way to get more is to either revisit more levels or relocate energy vials, which now provide you with less health than they used to. This one simple change made the entire game far more frustrating to get through, as I was not only being punished heavily for missing jumps that were badly designed in the first place due to the faulty camera, but now I was wasting even more time revisiting old stages just so that I wouldn't have to start a level at a severe disadvantage. The issues just keep piling up, unfortunately. While I do greatly appreciate the idea of making stages larger and more open for exploration, the actual sense of direction made it harder to enjoy because, well, there wasn't any. The game rarely gives you any idea of where you're actually supposed to go in each stage, leaving you to wander aimlessly and try using items on various things quite often. Now, to be fair, this is technically true of the original as well, but the more closed environments made it much less confusing to figure out, whereas here, there are multiple open spaces which have absolutely nothing in them, leading to a lot of wasted time and frustration. This also applies to some of the boss fights. Take this one with the Triceratops skeleton, for example. The game leaves you with no indication that you're actually supposed to run up the back of it in order to hit the glowing mark on its head. I kept trying to jump off the upper platform into him instead, and it set me back far longer than I'd like to admit. That said, the fight was pretty awesome once I realized what to do though. The stage Kew Gardens was also a huge pain, due to these sections where humans are being attacked by pumpkin soldiers, literally trying to turn the people into pumpkin soldiers themselves. In order to save them, you have to use an antidote to heal them, while simultaneously trying to take down the soldiers who drop more antidote. Hitting the pumpkin soldiers without hitting the humans can be extremely difficult to do, and losing a human, either by your hand or failing to heal them in time, will deduct from your chalice total. Get enough deaths on your hands, and you've already lost your chance at the chalice, having to replay the stage again until you do it right. This is yet another situation where things could have been handled a lot better. The story's also got some obvious tropes, and outside of helping the professor uncover a few things, I'm pretty sure Kia served no actual purpose outside of being eye candy for the crew, a love interest for Dan, and a plot device for Dan to get quote-unquote motivated with. All of these flaws aside, I'm not going to lie to you. I still ended up enjoying more things about this than not. Sure, it had some serious design issues, mostly associated with the camera and lack of direction for each stage, but once I learned to work around these things, I still came out enjoying myself and feeling excited to see what would lie ahead for Dan with each coming stage. I also got a kick out of the ending you get after gathering all of the chalices. Without going into spoilers, people used to debate whether or not this should be considered the bad ending due to its lack of a happy, well, ending. That said, I'm looking at it a little differently, and feel that if done right, this could actually be a setup to a proper third sequel, if Sony and the development team were so inclined. Fingers crossed, right? Would I recommend this game in the state it's in? Well, that's going to be a tough call. If you were a fan of the original and want to see what's in store for Dan next, then I say yes, absolutely go for it. While this game does have all kinds of issues that prevent it from being a must for everyone, it certainly got more than enough content to satisfy the hardcore fans who wanted something the same, but different, but the same, but different. If you are in the group that never played the first game, or simply wasn't impressed by it due to the outdated gameplay mechanics, I don't believe this title is likely to change your mind about that either. And that leaves us with the final question. Does MediEvil 2 deserve a remake? I believe it does, and here's why. Every single gameplay issue I mentioned before has the potential to be fixed. We already saw how the remake fixed the bad camera angles of the original MediEvil. Doing so with the second game would immediately fix a large amount of the issues people had with it to begin with. All they would need to do is tweak that, fix the issue of the health fountains disappearing after one use, and work a little better on giving the player an idea of where to actually go in the larger stages, to go a long, long way. Oh, and if they could make those pumpkin soldier sections a little more fair, that'd be great. While this game admittedly did not grab me in the same ways as the original, I still had a lot of fun with the new levels, gameplay additions, and characters who made it all worthwhile to me. Yes, even those last two levels. I do hope MediEvil 2 is given the chance to come back in the form of a remake someday, as I truly believe there is great material to be had here, and it'd be a shame not to see it make a comeback. And that's going to do it for this video. I hope you enjoyed. Let me know your thoughts on this game in the comments below, and stick around for one more spooky game video before the month closes out. And I'll see you all again soon.